Hi, everybody. Welcome back. We are actually on week 3 of the coursework, and today we're talking about establishing safety. You might have heard this term as boundaries, boundaries with consequences, or just regular ground rules between a relationship. But once you've had marital infidelity or other types of betrayal or just chronic abuse within the relationship, safety is something that goes by the wayside. You end up working and living in a relationship that's 100% toxic. And so we have to take a step back and deal with the festering wounds and to deal with the issue of safety so that there is even a space to rebuild trust, to explore vulnerability, to regulate our nervous system. And many times, whenever there isn't a safe home environment, to work inside, it's usually coming from a secondary emotion, but what's coming out is anger, right? We're angry, and so we lash out with our words, we lash out with our body. We may actually become physically violent. We may try to belittle, demean, be condescending towards our spouses if we feel we are justified in our anger. And so we don't try to actually control it. And one of the first things you have to realize is that no relationship is going to be able to communicate or rebuild trust when anger is involved. And so anger can be useful, but you have to first identify what is the root cause of the anger, and that's where you address. A lot of times, anger comes from fear. Somebody who feels like I'm either losing my marriage, or maybe I've been disrespected, and that's what's coming forward. A loss of control, and that is what's escalating the individuals to start to use, verbal abuse or heightened language to be able to get their point across. And of course, as the recipient of that, it's incredibly painful, right? It hurts, and then you yourself might even get defensive, and then you retaliate with your own words of anger. And right now we have a snowball effect, and we're rolling out of control. So establishing safety is very important. I think some people struggle with this idea of boundaries. Once you figure out what they are, then it would be to enforce them and enforce them with consequences. So we'll talk a little bit about that today. So, what's the foundation of healing? Where do we need to go? And I mentioned this already. You can read this little quote here on the screen, but it really isn't just the absence of harm. Some people think, well, I'm not being abused, so it's fine. But if you don't feel safe in your relationship, our body goes through physical changes, right? We have adrenaline and cortisol, those sort of things spike inside of our body, which already move us towards the edge of reacting versus being able to pause and think about how we want to respond. There's a lot of power in the time between the stimulus and the response. And that's how you can stop yourself from moving on to the attack and actually being able to stay in an open conversation and potentially have an ability to connect in deeper ways than you did before the potential betrayal. So ultimately, we want to know, why it matters, but then how do we know what it is? And sometimes if you've come from a healthy childhood or you've been in a marriage that's been very healthy and now you're in one that's toxic, you might not have any issues identifying that this is a real problem and boundaries need to be put up. I also find sometimes in Christian churches, they don't talk about boundaries. They feel that it should be kind of an open door policy. And I disagree with that because I do think that though many relationships can become safe, the lack of safety, the individual matters more than the relationship, first and foremost. And then, of course, followed by the relationship. And we all want relationships, we all want companionship. So we have to understand how the lack of safety shows up in our relationship so we know what's going on, so we know that we need to even address something. Many times we might even be enabling the situation. So if you feel like you're walking on eggshells, right? I can't speak to my partner. I don't know what my spouse is going to say. I think they're going to explode at any moment. That's a pretty good sign that anger is always kind of on the forefront inside your home. Hypervigilance, constant questioning, that can actually be an issue with safety where you feel more insecure. You don't know where you stand in the relationship. Maybe you have an emotionally withdrawn partner. And so, because of that, you're constantly bidding for that connection. So, you're Hey, how are things going? Are we okay? And that really just means you don't feel safe and you're looking for reassurance from your partner. Really, we need to find our identity and full reassurance in Christ. He's the one who centers us because everything else in the world, including our spouses, are going to change and disappoint us. So that's one way to do that. And then the other way, right, is to start opening up lines of communication that do start to foster some trust so you aren't on the hyper vigilant state. Many times, if you are hyper vigilant, then your partner is going to be the opposite, which is emotionally shutting down or withdrawing. And so many men typically go towards this, not always. We definitely see women that exhibit this symptom, but if you are withdrawing or pulling away from the relationship, right, you're probably avoiding hard conversations or conflicts, things that you need to address. You're keeping everything superficial. That might mean there's a lack of safety in the relationship. And then, common sense here, right? Anything that becomes explosive consistently is really a kind of a red flag that this is going to be an ongoing problem unless we really deal with the root cause. And I do know from my own personal experience that fear of rejection and being having a very critical spouse at one point drove me into many of these different things, and I just thought there was something wrong with me, and I felt uncomfortable in the relationship, but I wasn't able to communicate that, and ultimately, that caused an explosion later on. And so really consider if you're worried about judgment or punishment, scorekeeping in your marriage, then you could have a lack of safety. And we do talk about that it's not just a feeling. It is important to regulate your nervous system because if you are on high alert 24/7, you don't have the ability to truly stop and think with a rational mind. Everything feels like 0 to 100, doom, gloom. You're not going to be able to overcome what's happening in front of you. Even small challenges seem to send a shock wave of issues throughout your relationship. So it is important that you identify first that this is an unsafe environment, and then you want to be able to identify how is it affecting me, both physically and emotionally, because you're going to need to communicate that with your partner. And then you need to do some things to help bring safety back into the relationship. There are things you can do separate, right? There are things like going on a walk can help you de-stress, regulate yourself. We talked earlier about tools like tapping for trauma, bring yourself back to awareness of your own body, holding an ice cube in your hand, that sort of thing. But then you also do have to do the hard part, which is communicating with the other person that this feels dangerous. It feels risky. I want to be able to communicate with you without things blowing up. And sometimes getting a third person involved, it can be helpful in starting to set the pace and build towards trust where you can have those conversations on your own. So many times, both partners are actually responsible for having creating an unsafe environment, but nothing is ever equal, right? So very rarely is the wife and the husband both contributing 50-50 to the problem. Usually it's ones that contribute more than the other. Let's just say 70-30 for, example's sake. You have to really be honest with yourself. What can you own in the cause of an unsafe household? What are you doing that could be perpetuating this cycle or pushing your partner further into deeper despair or retaliatory behavior, right? They may own 90% of the problem, but you have to show up with your 10%. I like to say, own your 1%. So are you being dishonest when you communicate? Because the fear of conflict is so intense for you that you don't want to give the full truth of how you feel, so you gloss over it, half truths. Well, people can sense the elephant in the room, so to speak. They know when someone's being dishonest. That creates a fracture in the foundation. This can obviously go into lack of transparency. Oh, you don't need to worry about the finances. You don't need to know more about this thing that I had going on in the past. It was in the past. No, that's not how a relationship works. A relationship works with transparency, vulnerability for both individuals, past, present, and future. And so any kind of secrecy, of course, breeds, suspicion. It makes you feel like there's something here and I can't put my finger on it, which is automatically going to put you into the snooping mode, or I need to research, or maybe I need to control the situation by being on top of it and becoming a nag, right? That's not what we want. So we have to get to, well, why are you hiding this? What are you afraid of? Why can't we share in this load? And realistically, it may bring about things that are harder to hear in the short term, but in the long term, you're not going to live with a chronic instability inside your home, right? So higher intensity of pain for shorter period of time versus a chronic lifetime worth of pain inside your marriage. Another thing we see a lot at Commit and Conquer is blame shifting. If you are constantly saying, well, I wouldn't have done this if you did this, or you are the cause of my issues. We have to take agency and ownership that we are responsible for ourselves, our responses, the things that come out of our mouths, the choices that we make, and nobody can make us feel a certain way. So, again, this comes rooted in the Word of God and understanding how important and valuable you are, that you've been adopted into His sonship. So we all are sons and daughters, brothers and sisters in Christ. And so when somebody treats you poorly, you realize that's not a reflection of me. That's a reflection of this other person, which does allow you to not go down the rabbit hole with your partner if they're the ones doing the shame and the blame game. Dismissing how your partner feels. Of course, it talks about a betrayed partner here, but anytime in marriage, sometimes husbands, men have a tendency to want to fix, but women do this too. I know I do. You want to fix, but when you fix quickly and you don't actually listen to learn, listen to hear what the person is saying to understand, then they feel dismissed. So even though you feel like you're helping because you're fixing, you're actually communicating, I've got the solutions. You shouldn't worry about this. This isn't a big deal. And you miss the opportunity to connect with your spouse. So you have to realize that you have communicated through your actions, uh, unloving care towards your spouse. And so you need to own that you've created a lot of deeper wounds and resentment, and that you need to allow your partner to actually feel the things that you've done and said that have really hurt them. And both people are going to have it on both sides. And there's a process to do that. And we call those weekly truth and love. Well, you guys will get to that at some point in that in terms of practice. But again, it really requires consistency of identifying these issues and starting to put some plans in place to break the process so you don't continue to live in an unsafe environment. Long term, that wreaks havoc on your body. So here's a little moment to take a mini prompt. So write down two specific areas in your relationship where you feel unsafe, emotionally or physically. So for me, one was about finances. I could not talk about finances because I perceived that my husband really believed that he knew all the answers, that I couldn't contribute to anything, so he didn't want to share. And in some ways, I almost believed it, not really realizing that no, in a household, a family, we share responsibilities equal. It doesn't mean we might not, one person might not own that, but when it comes to decision making, it becomes an equal thing. And learning that your spouse has a different gift than you have. So even though they might not do it the way you do it, you can still see it as an asset, not a hindrance. So think about things like that. It could be something as simple as yelling and screaming in the home instead of being able to communicate with a normal tone because everything's just heightened and escalated. So take about 2 or 3 minutes here to write down two areas in which you would like to speak with your spouse about feeling unsafe inside of the marriage. Okay, we'll give you another 30 seconds here. All right. Now that you've written that down, you want to practice it. So this does mean sitting down with your spouse, but you need to first start with, this is what I'm trying to communicate. I'm not going to get it right, but this is where I want to go. So letting them know, hey, I feel like our home is unsafe. I'm sure you feel the same way, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about that. Can we have some time this week to tell the truth? Truth telling, right? If we have love without the truth, then we're really just being selfish and avoidant. We're not really caring more about the other person. And if we have more truth and love, then we're really just cruel. We're just telling our truth and not really considering the other person's perspective. So you do have to have both. So start with finding a good space and time that is neutral. So if you're going to have somebody involved, you want to get somebody who's unbiased. Try to do it earlier in the day, right? By the end of the day, we're exhausted, so we don't have as much mental capacity for dealing with things. And find a carved out time away from the kids and others where you can truly listen without being defensive. What that really means is you are going to let the person share their feelings, even if it feels like an attack, without justifying or explaining away. So what happens many times, we feel defensive and we have to prove that that's not true. That's black and white thinking, right? All or nothing. It is possible that maybe what they're saying isn't right, but that is how they feel. You can acknowledge how they feel without proving that you're right or wrong. That's how you listen without defensiveness. When you do respond, you can even start with asking, hey, can I respond to this? I would like to share what I heard. That's reflective listening. So you're going to repeat back what you heard. And when you do that, you are actually creating empathy because you're saying, I heard you through my active listening. I didn't get defensive. And now I'm going to validate your feelings because I'm hearing you the way you want to be heard, right? Because you're repeating back to them what you heard and they can confirm or deny that's accurate or not. You may find many times what they're communicating is not what you're understanding. So you will have to dig through what is the real truth to understand one another because you're not, no two people are the same. And then the go forward of this, the ask. We want to set boundaries here. We don't want to keep this behavior going. It's not healthy for either one of us. Our children are watching this. So, more can we do? So, you want to set limits that protect both of you. So, a boundary is not one sided, like you can't talk to me after 5 p.m. Well, that's just choosing selfishness. But a boundary may be let's always schedule time to talk and we'll look a week out and pick a time that we're going to schedule just for us. That's joint. It's creating a plan for each of you, and so that is a healthy, respectful boundary setting. Boundaries can even be, you can have marital boundaries, but you can even have individual boundaries. So, as an individual person, I know that if I'm not doing my Bible study and working out and considering the needs of my friends and my neighbors, then I'm typically going into a selfish mode. And that starts to become like a red flag behavior. And so I might put on there, if I'm not meeting with my friends once a month, that becomes a boundary that something could be wrong. I need to do something here if I'm engaging in other behaviors such as self-isolation. So, boundaries don't have to be just about creating safety, but it also is your behavior that communicates, I care about this relationship and I'm not going to go down a rabbit hole with my own needs. So it can be something like that. Of course, boundaries of, if we feel like our heart rates are getting too high in a conversation, we take a 5 minute break. And some people actually wear Apple Watches and have a monitor on their phone that if their heart rate gets over 100 beats per minute, then at that point they know they need to take a 5 minute break and it alerts them. So it's a great way to work through creating some new patterns when things are heated and intense. So you'll set those ground rules with each other, right? You're going to share them openly. You're going to write them down. I use my phone in the notes section. I share the one I share them with my spouse. So this is my personal boundaries. These are our marital boundaries. And then you review and adjust them regularly. You might get rid of one bad habit, but you pick up another. That's a perfect time to then say, all right, we need to adjust because we've developed some coping strategies, workarounds, so to speak. And we want to really make sure that we're committing to what we intentionally intended to make our partner feel safe, right? Because the goal is both of you do feel safe, especially when being triggered. So this has to be put into practice. I feel like this is where everybody falls off track. They typically they relate to the topic. They realize safety is an issue. They're either too afraid to have the initial conversation or they don't follow through with their boundaries. And that's a lot of times where, consequences kind of have to come in. Like, okay, if you keep breaking a boundary, then we have to escalate. And what's the consequence if we break that boundary again? And again, you want to do this with your partner so that everybody is in agreement before we move forward because we don't want to impose a consequence that the other person wasn't expecting, feels unfair, right? So again, we want to just walk through these kind of four pillars here. We're going to create safety. It's going to lead to vulnerability. You'll be able to feel your feelings, which I know many of us don't want to do. We hurt, and many times when we hurt, we try to numb with other things, or we try to use secondary emotions to cover it up. Like I'd rather be angry, or I'd rather be self-righteous than really deal with the pain that I'm feeling inside. But you do have to feel the pain. And I can tell you, the deeper your pain, the higher the joy on the other side. You don't have so-called happiness, but for sure joy and gratitude in your life without experiencing pain. So we're going to move through that pain. And the goal then would be to rebuild connection. That's where intimacy comes in. You're going to create new patterns and you'll see a totally different life. So find that one thing you can do today to change your marriage in this upcoming weeks. It could be something small. They talk about putting your phone down here, but definitely having weekly check-ins to start is very important. If it's a set schedule, you will find that it's a lot easier when you're afraid to enter into that conversation because it's something you've already pre-agreed to versus feeling like, oh, we're having a good day and I don't want to mess it up by talking about our stuff. It becomes just part of your life to do a check-in to see how are you feeling today? Have we been hitting our goals and setting our boundaries and following through? So once you have safety, I know you will be able to move towards these other stages of healing. And I also want you to know that every human deserves the right to be in a safe, stable environment. And so, toxicity, abusiveness, these sort of things, though they may happen, they cannot be habitual, right? Because there is no relationship when we use those type of tactics and manipulation, that sort of things inside of our relationship. So I look forward to taking you on this journey and the next lesson with you. I hope this is certainly helpful. If you need more one-on-one time, feel free to go to my landing page on my website there and you can schedule real time with me. Of course, the first consultation is always free and we'll figure out where you're stuck and how we can get you to move forward.